Santos from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and I'm the president of the International Atherosclerosis Society. And today I have the pleasure to share the IAS COVID-19 webcast. Why IAS is dealing with COVID? Because actually it's not only a disease that affects the lungs, it's not only an infectious disease, actually is a vasculopathy that affects the vessels, affects the heart, affects the different arteries, the kidneys, and so on. And actually, this is extremely important because actually individuals who already have cardiovascular disease are probably, or those who have many risk factors for that, actually are the most vulnerable patients to develop the complications of COVID-19. Unfortunately, we had lots of uncertainty about how to understand this disease, to deal with this disease. But actually on the last few months, finally, we're starting to have the results of the randomized clinical trials. And actually, they are giving us a lot of information on how to manage our patients better. And actually, there are still many trials going on. And I have the pleasure to be with you today, actually with Dr. Peter Landsberg from the Netherlands, who's a member of the IAS European Federation. And also he coordinates not only our statin newsletter, but also a newsletter on the COVID-19 and the huge amount of data that has been published so far. So Peter actually is curating this literature. He's very aware of what's going on. In addition, I have the pleasure to be with my good friend, Dr. Otávio Berwanger from the Albert Einstein Hospital in São Paulo. He's the head of the academic research organization. Otávio has been doing clinical research for many years, and actually Brazilians, fortunately, are working very hard with the coalition of many hospitals and publishing many important papers in the literature. And also, I have the pleasure to have Dr. Michael Coring, who's a cardiologist and a clinical researcher. He's the past president of the Physician Academy for Clinical Research. And nowadays he's doing many clinical trials, and he's the president of NCOR, a clinical site in Jacksonville, Florida, and has tons of experience with these clinical trials with COVID. So it's really a very, very nice possibility of discussing what's going on clinical trials with this disease. So Peter, I leave it to you, my friend.
Honored to be part of this panel today. I think we have some very distinguished researchers, clinical researchers, that can help to clarify some of the issues regarding day-to-day management of COVID-19 patients. I've been involved with trying to create a literature update newsletter about everything that's being published on COVID-19. And just to give you an illustration, the amount of data is staggering. Weekly, there is roughly 1,000 to 1,200 publications. The first publication came out in January. So before January, there was no publication in PubMed. There are now over 50,000 publications in PubMed. I think there is no other topic that has gained such popularity over such a short period of time. And that brings me actually to the first question. I'm sure most of you will be aware that although some very reputable journals have been involved in publishing news about COVID-19, I think we still need to be very critical with the information that we have access to. Some of the data is not as reliable, not as solid as we thought it was. And I would like to ask you, Dr. Berenger, if there are certain issues within your field of expertise that you would like to highlight as something that we have to be aware of when looking at literature, looking at management, pharmacological management of COVID-19 patients.
Thanks very much, Dr. Landsberg, Dr. Santos. It's a pleasure to be here. And I also thank the IAS for promoting this event and this forum, for the invitation. Yeah, so that's critical. I always say that knowledge is the greatest enemy of the disease. And for generating sound knowledge, we need sound evidence, and we need evidence for robust randomized clinical trials. So you're absolutely right. We've seen a lot of studies, retrospective studies, with several limitations, published as preprint form, and it ended up being shared in social media and with audios and videos and claiming, you know, miraculous cures for COVID-19, and that's not going to happen. We need to conduct the proper randomized trials in order to address the efficacy and the safety of different therapies. I can provide some examples for the colleagues who are seeing us today, which here in Brazil, for example, unfortunately, Brazil became one of the epicenters for COVID-19, as you were all aware of. But at the same time, I mean, that gave us the opportunity to conduct a lot of randomized trials. And what we're doing here, we have a coalition. So it's a coalition of the top and leading institutions in the country in order to conduct randomized clinical trials to answer important questions. So I can quickly summarize what we know so far. So we published about 3 weeks ago in the New England Journal, the first of our trials was a trial of hydroxychloroquine, either alone or with azithromycin in patients who were hospitalized with mild to moderate disease, and of course, all patients with COVID-19. Unfortunately, this trial did not show any benefits of either using hydroxychloroquine alone or in combination with azithromycin. And so that's clearly one treatment that for hospitalized patient, it doesn't seem to be an option. About a few minutes ago, our second trial just came out in JAMA, and this is a trial testing steroids. We use a dexamethasone in patients with COVID-19 and IRDS, so patients with a very severe form of COVID-19. And we're happy to announce that this trial showed that the ventilator-free days were greater with dexamethasone than with in the standard of care group. We, together with that, JAMA published today a trial conducted in France, another trial conducted in China, another trial conducted in North America. And we also had together with the WHO, a pre-specified meta-analysis of all these studies, which is available today at JAMA 2. And this meta-analysis lumping together all these trials plus the recovery trial, which was a very important trial conducted in the UK. It shows a reduction of all-cause mortality by using steroids. So I think finally we have a clear winner for COVID-19, especially for patients who need any form of respiratory support. There are other ongoing trials. This week it should come out another trial of us with azithromycin. So this is also hopefully can inform clinical practice as well. And we have ongoing trials here in Brazil with anticoagulants. I'm a cardiologist myself, besides a clinical trialist. So we are doing a trial with rivaroxaban in these patients with moderate of COVID-19, which are moderate or severe, in moderate and severe patients. We have a collaboration with colleagues from the US and from Europe in doing a trial with dapagliflozin in COVID-19 patients who have diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or renal disease, or hypertension. This trial is ongoing. And our coalition is also conducting trials with monoclonal antibodies, anti-IL-6, JAK2 inhibitors. These trials are also ongoing. And we also have some trials with plasma. So all these efforts are ongoing, and hopefully they will be able to share some important information with the colleagues that could potentially inform guidelines and inform clinical practice.
Yes, that's quite an impressive list that you shared with us. And I think the key word that should pop up is the randomized control clinical trials. There's a lot of observational data, which is always bothered with confounding factors. So having randomized control clinical trials and also collaborations where we can see different countries pooling patients together to have sufficient amount of patients looking at subgroups. One of the things that I think is extremely challenging as well is some of the therapies are used in more advanced stages of the disease. And of course, a lot of people are very anxious to know what can I do to prevent it. And I think that's something that's still lagging a little bit behind, that we're more focusing on the severely ill patients and see how we can help them survive or have less symptoms. But the large number of patients that don't enter that phase, is there anything you could tell about that? Are there preventive strategies we can use in those kind of patients?
Yeah, so it's still, of course, hydroxychloroquine gained a lot of news because of it became something bigger than the clinical research field itself, which is of course very challenging as we know. But there's still trials testing hydroxychloroquine as a preventive measure or as a prophylactic measure. These trials are ongoing. We have one in Brazil there, and this is in patients with mild disease which are not hospitalized. There are large trials ongoing in healthcare professionals. So hopefully this can also be some information that would be helpful, but we need to wait for the proper trials. And other people, of course, are proposing other forms of therapies like chemostat and other drugs that, I mean, repositioning old drugs that could be helpful. And of course, non-pharmacological therapies are still a must: social distancing, using facial masks and everything else. So, and of course, I think it will be discussed in a minute about, of course, the vaccine trials, which probably are the hottest topic in terms of preventing the disease.
I'm going to ask you to have some more information about ACE inhibitors. I think that's really a debated topic, if patients should be continuing them, should stop them, or even start them. But before that, there have been some studies looking at vitamin D, and also, especially in the Twitter sphere, there's a lot of rumors going around in lifestyle. You know, should we start exercising and lose weight, because, you know, the diabetics and the obese are the ones that are most at risk. Is there anything you can say about this?
Well, so far, what we know, it's yes, some patient lifestyle may play a role, but what we have is secondary data from databases and from retrospective studies. So a sort of a mystery is why young patients, because we know that the elderly, patients with diabetes, patients with established cardiovascular disease are the ones who have greater mortality. But we also learned that some young patients, and we understand exactly why. Unfortunately, COVID-19 is a disease that we know for 9 months or so, or even less than that. So that in history, in medicine, that's absolutely nothing. So there's a lot of, we don't know very well the biology, the mechanisms, the physiopathology of COVID-19, which poses a lot of challenges. We know that obesity may play a role, and some case series and retrospective and small retrospective observational studies and some studies with secondary data suggest that specifically the obese patients, so younger patients who are obese, are facing worse outcomes. But we don't know yet whether a healthy lifestyle, that we use it a lot in preventive cardiology, and I'm sure it's well debated in the IAS events, whether this will play a role or not in actually preventing patients for either having COVID-19, or if they do, whether it will prevent them for having a more severe presentation of the disease. So it's still, but of course, I think it's a hot topic, and that's an area that deserves further research. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Now, let's dive into the ACE inhibitors and ARBs. I think, first of all, can you explain why there is such a controversy? I think for a lot of doctors, it's confusing. There's the ACE2 receptor, there's ACE inhibition, and there are some benefits of blocking ACE2, but there is also harms associated. Could you explore that a little bit so that it becomes a better understanding?
Yeah, let me try to explain that in a very generic and practical way, and then move to what we have from results from randomized trials so far. So it's seems like a double-edged sword. So we know that the virus, spike it binds to the ACE2 receptor, and we have this receptor. Of course, we know we have that in the heart, but we have that in lungs, in kidneys, in the gastrointestinal tracts also. So we know that a virus needs to bind to this receptor to enter the cells and then to spread the infection and multiply itself. So, and we know that if patients are using ACE inhibitors or ARBs, it's a double-edged sword, whether if by blocking the system, patients will have more receptors available as a compensatory mechanisms and thus will have a worse infection, or whether on the other hand, if you're blocking the system, you're actually protecting the patients. Of course, I'm oversimplifying something that is very complex, but because I want to be practical here. So the mechanisms are not entirely understood, but they seem to be very complex. But in very generic words, with an oversimplification, this is what happens. So we don't know whether it's beneficial or harmful. What we know so far, it's from, of course, observational studies. Observational studies, they don't suggest that patients were, for example, you have a patient with hypertension of heart failure, where especially a patient with heart failure, where we know these therapies are life-saving, they reduce mortality and major cardiovascular events. Whether stopping them while they have the infection will protect them or actually be harmful. We conducted here in Brazil a trial called the Brace Corona 2 trial. This trial was just presented at the European Society of Cardiology. This was a trial in patients mostly with mild, some with moderate diseases, and this majority of patients were patients with hospitalized patients with hypertension. Minority were patients with heart failure. So there's still a lot of research to be conducted in heart failure. But what this trial suggests, it didn't make any difference in terms of the COVID-19, and the primary outcome were days alive and out of the hospital in this trial, but we also assessed all-cause mortality and other important clinical endpoints. It doesn't seem to make a difference to withdraw the ACE inhibitors or ARBs while these patients are hospitalized. So despite the fact that the ACE2 inhibitors play a big role in terms of the physiopathology and the mechanisms to which COVID-19 can cause its harmful consequences, to this point, it doesn't seem that we need to stop ACE inhibitors or ARBs in our patients with hypertension, and of course, heart failure deserves more research. And that's my take on the ACE inhibitor ARBs controversy.
And there have even some people that voiced that they could be protective, so that giving them to prevent, not so much for hypertension or heart failure, but to prevent serious complication. I think that's one step too far, right?
Exactly. That also, we don't have a clear signal of, it haven't been shown any signal of harm, whether as I mentioned, it's a double-edged sword, whether it could be beneficial, it remains to be determined by robust trials.
I want to switch to Dr. Koren as well, to keep it a little bit lively among all the panelists. What we saw is that the ACE2 receptor binds to the spike of the coronavirus. And I think that's also considered to be the main target of vaccine development. Is that right?
Well, thanks for the question, Peter, and thank you for inviting me to this great presentation and seminar. So let me just comment about a couple of things before I get to a more specific answer to your question. First, I'll weigh in on the lifestyle issue, and you mentioned that, and my take on that to my patients has been the most important lifestyle change that you should make is to stay out of bars. So we can talk about a lot of things, but quite frankly, there's some very simple things that you can do to protect yourself from COVID-19. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about the comments so far is talking about just the massive amount of information we're getting about COVID-19 and the different levels of evidence. And obviously, we understand that there's quality to evidence and that the highest quality evidence tends to be double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. But in the interim, while these trials are being conducted, we have to make decisions as clinicians. And I think this program is for a clinical audience, and we want to be practical about that. So the discussion around ACE inhibitors is really, really interesting. So I'd like to point out to my colleagues and to my patients that despite the fact that COVID-19 has been devastating in many places around the world, in most Western countries, including in the US and particularly in my state of Florida where I practice, we're seeing many more patients die of cardiovascular disease each week, each month, each day than COVID-19. And we know that ACE inhibitors and ARBs are very effective at preventing cardiovascular deaths. So the first question that I would ask is that we would want to be really, really certain that we don't overreact in terms of saying the wrong message about ACEs and ARBs and inadvertently cause more harm due to increased cardiovascular disease. So until we have definitive answers, I would say in terms of stopping ACE or ARBs because we're concerned about greater virulence of the virus or increased complications, that would be a huge mistake. And then I was really excited to wake up this morning and see the results of the BRACE Corona trial, which show that people who are already on ACEs and ARBs should not stop them once they're diagnosed with COVID-19 infections because there seemed to be no difference in outcomes in a randomized trial that either stopped them or continued them in hospitalized patients. So that's a piece of the puzzle, and that is reassuring to people who are treating patients in the hospital that there's no need to stop these drugs once people are on them. And then for the prevention aspects, I would again reiterate the fact that we don't want to stop drugs that are life-saving for the possibility that they could be making something else worse. That would be a mistake. And this kind of gets into the whole issue of clinical equipoise. It's very important as we look at data and evidence that we don't rush to judgment or assume that we know the answer before we know them. And there have been many examples of that so far in this whole COVID-19 crisis. My favorite one to relate to people is the fact that in the US at least, there was huge discussion in March and April about the need for ventilators. Everything is about ventilators. We don't have enough ventilators. We need more ventilators. Well, now, a few months down the road, most of us are convinced that ventilators actually kill people when they have COVID-19, that they could actually exacerbate the inflammatory cascade. In fact, very, very few patients at my hospital now are being treated with ventilators, and high-flow oxygen is really the way we're treating folks instead of early use of ventilators. So this is a great example of using clinical equipoise and not jumping to conclusions. So now to transition to the vaccine space, I've been very active in that. Just by way of introduction to the audience, I am a cardiologist. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Encore Research Group, which is a group of 100 physicians that are engaged in multi-specialty trials here in the state of Florida. And we've been very involved with the COVID vaccine studies, particularly using the mRNA platform. And this is just really, really exciting technology. For those of the audience that are not familiar with it, the mRNA platform gives us the opportunity of just giving a little piece of genetic code to patients and allowing them to make the spike protein, which in turn is eliciting an immune response. And we think that immune response is protective. Based on preliminary information, we know that patients that are treated with these vaccines have very high levels of neutralizing antibodies against the spike protein and preventing that protein from interacting with the ACE2 receptor as mentioned. More broadly, keep in mind that most coronaviruses in general cannot infect human cells, and there are variations of the spike protein that make it able to bind with the ACE2 receptor and in turn infect human cells. So the thinking is that if we can prepare antibodies against these spike proteins, that will neutralize their ability to actually infect human cells. So that's a really exciting part of this puzzle, and we do know at this point that these vaccines do provide that. Now, whether or not that's the key element of pathogenesis is still a subject of debate. So for example, we know that certain viruses like polio require some sort of viremia to cause their worst effects. Other viruses like hepatitis C are spread in the body cell to cell, and having a viremic state is less important. So antibodies perhaps are not as effective at preventing the spread of those particular type of viruses. Where COVID-19 fits in is still a subject of debate. We think that the viremic stage is important for the worst of the illness, but we're not sure whether or not that will protect the early forms or things that may affect the nasal passages or the bronchial tree, et cetera. But we do think that this probably will be effective at preventing the worst outcomes from COVID-19. But again, it remains to be seen. At this point, the the clinical trial community has really risen to the task. Literally 1,000 people a day are being enrolled in these studies around the world, probably more than that by next week, because more and more sites are being open. And both of the mRNA studies that are worldwide will be fully enrolled within 2 weeks. And we should have answers to the question about how effective these vaccines are probably late November, early December, if the vaccines are, as anticipated, or at least 70% effective. So very, very exciting time in terms of our ability as a clinical trial community to help answer question and to take a new technology and show whether or not it can respond to a public health crisis.
Yeah. One of the questions that pops up with patients sometimes is, you have a vaccine, you tested that it's effective, why not just give it? Why do we have to wait for, long-term results from trial? It works. Could you explain?
And again, the whole question of clinical equipoise. So again, it's nice to assume that everything we do is beneficent, but in point of fact, we just don't know. And I mentioned the situation with ventilators. Hydroxychloroquine is another example. Azithromycin is another example. There are many examples of what we thought would be beneficial based on small observational studies. Turns out not to be, and in fact, it can even be harmful. And of course, we also have to weigh short-term versus long-term effects. So when you use a vaccine, we do it to prevent short-term infection, but we hope that we don't have any long-term complications, which is a whole nother debate that will occur. Obviously, we have a lot of political pressure and social pressure to get a product on the market as quickly as possible, but we wouldn't know, for example, how long is the protective effect of the vaccine? Does it work for 3 months? Does it work for 6 months? Does it work for a year? Traditionally, we would wait at least a year, not 2 years, to see the duration of the effect of the vaccines, but under the current circumstances, I don't think that's true. Of course, we just really want to have good information about short-term toxicity. We want to have good information, at least for a 3 to 6 month period, that there's a trend towards better outcomes, fewer COVID infections, and hopefully no offsetting side effect that would make us concerned about using these. And those are important features in terms of even who gets the vaccine. So every virus has its characteristics. So if you compare COVID-19 with, say, the Spanish flu from 100 years ago, you're seeing a completely different demographic profile. So I'd like to remind people that in 1918, we were looking at 5 or 6% mortality rates amongst young, healthy people aged 18 to 24 that contracted the Spanish flu. In this case, we're seeing very, very low rates of mortality amongst the same demographic. So I looked at the data from the state of Florida, and I found that only 1 in 4,000 people seem to die of COVID-19 in that age group. So that's a huge difference than another virus that we dealt with 100 years ago. And interestingly, 100 years ago, the miracle drug was aspirin. And in retrospect, one of the reasons we think there may have been such a high mortality rate for the Spanish flu is that we're using 8 or 10 grams or even 20 grams of aspirin a day, which probably was doing people more harm than good. So again, clinical equipoise is really, really important. We need good evidence, and then we need to use that evidence so that we get the treatments to the people who are most vulnerable, that have the lowest risk, and do that balance. That comes down to a clinical question often, but I think we have a good group of educated physicians and be part of the educational process to let people know how to make those balancing decisions.
Yeah. One of the unwanted features that surfaces every now and then is the fact that people who have been infected and cured seem to become reinfected. Is that something that worries you in terms of vaccine development, or is that something that we should take into account, that it happens in a small number of patients, and that the reinfection might actually be mitigated a little bit because you have been infected before? Right.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We have just very preliminary data. My spin on it is that we know that there have been changes in the strain of COVID-19 already. They don't seem to be major changes from the information that I've read, but that has to be monitored. When people get reinfected, it could be because of a new strain, or it could be a failure of their particular immune system, and we don't know that. But we are looking at, really tens of millions of cases of COVID-19, and the number of reports of reinfection are really, really, really small. So I would guess at this point that this is not a major problem, but it's certainly a problem that we need to look at. The flip side, by the way, is that we know that there is sort of cross-immunogenicity. So, the famous example of that is smallpox vaccine is actually not a vaccine for smallpox. It's a vaccine for cowpox. And so we know that even if you don't have the exact right immune response, there is a crossover. And so I'm going to guess that the reinfection rate is way, way lower than the crossover response. So even if there are variations of COVID-19, there's a good chance that the vaccine will still have some effectiveness against those variations.
Yeah. A last question before I go back to Dr. Berlinger. The vaccine program is not a single injection, right? It has to be a dual or maybe even a triple injection. And how well is it tolerated by the patients that participated in the trial? Is it like the immunization shot you get when you're small, or is it something that does trigger a response in the body that could cause some symptoms?
Sure, great question. So just to answer it broadly first, keep in mind that there are, as of my last review, 145 vaccines that have been registered with WHO. There are 18 that are in clinical trials.
Yeah.
The messenger RNA studies that I'm very involved with involve two sponsors, major sponsors, Pfizer and Moderna here in the U.S. Those, the Pfizer studies I know have a very large presence in Latin America, so thank you to our Latin American colleagues. And we know that we have tens of thousands of people in the messenger RNA vaccine program. The AstraZeneca program, which is using a modified adenovirus, a little bit of a different platform, also has tens of thousands of people that are participating. And then there are many, many other programs out there that have way smaller numbers. So now getting to my experience, I've been involved now in probably about 500 patients that have been in the studies. These are all placebo-controlled studies, all 2-to-1 placebo-controlled. So half of them have gotten active ingredient, half of them have gotten placebo. I'm blinded to that information, so I don't know specifics. But there has been remarkably little in terms of injection site reactions, remarkably little in terms of adverse events over the first month or so of experience in these studies. So that's very, very pleasing and very, very satisfying to see that. It's interesting, obviously people have a human tendency to try to predict whether or not they've gotten the active vaccine or placebo. And I would say because the benign presentations that we're seeing, it's going to be very difficult for patients to make that guess and make that calculation correctly. So far so good in terms of the clinical responses.
Professor Coren, there is one other therapeutic dilemma that I would like you to address, and that's remdesivir. It was touted as one of the more potent drugs to address COVID-19, but I think there is some drawbacks now as well. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So remdesivir is a very interesting therapeutic. It was originally developed to fight the Ebola crisis from a few years ago. So it was actually on the shelf when COVID-19 hit us. And it was studied in first a few small open label studies, but there is now a randomized clinical trial that show it's effective. Now, the question with remdesivir is the fact, and it's related to its mechanism of action, which is to block RNA polymerase, which is critical in terms of the virus reproducing itself. So it'll block the coronavirus RNA polymerase, which you would think would be best to use early in the course of disease. And the studies that have been done have looked at it later in the course of disease. So this is an interesting point about having now information that shows that a therapeutic is effective in a randomized clinical trial, and how do we deploy that? So here in our community in Florida, we are using it for hospitalized patients that have severe respiratory illness. But I would argue that ideally this should be used earlier in the course of disease, not wait till people are hospitalized necessarily. And so it's an interesting dilemma right now, is we have something that has been proven to be safe, that on average the efficacy is better than any side effect profile, and how do we deploy this therapeutic that has been actually proven? So that's where clinical judgment comes into place, as well as local resource determinations and also making the argument for expanding clinical trials to look at other populations.
Is there a trial going on now for early use of remdesivir in patients that are less ill or just, seropositive?
There are trials. I'm not specifically involved in any of them, but I am familiar with the fact that it is being studied in a number of different settings, including prevention of people who are contacts of folks that have COVID-19, as well as earlier in the course of disease. So those trials are ongoing, yes.
Okay. Dr. Berbering, I was talking about the vaccine. I'm thinking about another treatment modality that gained a lot of attention, especially in the US, which is the convalescent plasma therapy. Are you familiar with that? Can you explain what's the mechanism? How does it work? And what can we expect from it?
Yeah, so once again, in a very generic way, I'm not directly involved in convalescent plasma research.
Yeah.
I know my hospital and some of friends from our coalition are involved in that. Basically, patients who recover from COVID-19, their plasma containing antibodies may be beneficial in preventing or even treating the disease and prompting immune response of patients with the other patients who have the disease. So what we know so far it seems to be safe, right? And we have small randomized trials suggesting that it may be, these trials are hypothesis generating, suggesting that it may be beneficial, but I think we still need to have more robust randomized trial data. And it's been a good discussion about the equipoise. It's people used to think, if always doing something, it's better than doing nothing. And that is clearly a wrong path. We learned that in cardiology, several therapies that we thought were very beneficial ended up being harmful, as was just explained. And we need to, when we have uncertainty, the most ethical way to treat our patients is to randomize them, is to put them in the randomized trials. And we need to bring, some people think, well, clinical practice here, randomized trials is here. These are two words which are apart. And we don't think so. We need to do more pragmatic trials, trials which are more representative. And I think in the plasma case, once again, it's not something that I'm directly involved with in terms of clinical research, but I'm aware of some important clinical randomized trials that are ongoing. And I think we should wait from their results. And I think it's in my view, it's still an experimental therapy. The data we have so far, once again, points towards safety. And it's, in terms of efficacy, it's hypothesis generating. It may be a signal there, but it needs to be properly tested before that's implemented as a therapeutic approach. So that's my take on convalescent plasma.
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge now is that there is so much, or so many patients are just put on convalescent plasma without being in a trial protocol. So tens of thousands have been treated, but we don't know if the treatment is effective because we don't have a comparator. I think that is something of great concern, because then we're doing something with blindfolds and not knowing what is the right dosage, what is the right patient, how many times should they have convalescent plasma. We're swimming in the dark and just trying something that might be helpful. Had we organized that better from the start, we would have easily been able to conduct a proper trial, giving us clear answers. Absolutely, yeah.
That's something, just to your point, very quick, and this is something we want to keep the message very practical here, and I'm talking about randomized trials, but I want to bring to people's attention that we need to understand why that is the case. Why, when we have the randomized trial, is a proper way to do it, because and this path of always doing something, it's better than doing nothing, can be very wrong. And once again, we learned that. Because the reason that people usually do is, if I give a patient a therapy and you don't have a comparator, and the patient gets better, we tend to say, well, he's doing better because I gave him hydroxychloroquine or convalescent plasma. And if the patients ended up, getting worse or even dying, say, well, the disease was very severe. So any harmful event or undesirable event is attributed to the disease. Any beneficial event is attributed to the therapy. And that's not the case. If you don't have a comparator, and if you don't create groups which are equal in terms of known and unknown characteristics, and only randomization can achieve that, you will never know if you're actually doing harm to your patient. So it's very important when you have uncertainty, please try to learn if in your institute, we know that not all institutions are in the randomized trials and that not be available. And of course, I understand that some people who are in the front line, you need to make some tough decisions in clinical practice and use your judgment and use equipoise, and that's fair. I completely accept that. But if there is in your institution or in your city, you know, a randomized trial ongoing, the best option for your patient is to include him in the randomized trial and talk to your colleague investigators. That's my suggestion.
They conducted, I think it was at Livermore, where they did a huge computational analysis of the virus and its potential targets. And to summarize it very briefly, they said that most likely the culprit that can explain a lot of the symptomatology and a lot of the effects of the COVID SARS is bradykinin. And that what the virus does is actually it upregulates the ACE2 receptor. It upregulates it in tissues where there is normally very little ACE2, and then it disrupts the bradykinin system. So what you get is more or less similar, like the side effects that you get with ACE, similar symptomatology, but also vascular leakage. Bradykinin can induce vascular leakage. This happens, for instance, also in the lungs. And not only do you get vascular leakage, you also get activation of hyaluronic acid. And that creates sort of a foam-like, a jello-like substance in the lungs that completely clogs the lungs and that makes ventilation almost impossible. And it explains a lot of the symptoms. It explains some of the coagulation problems. It explains some of the, you know, the COVID toe, the neurological problems, because also the blood-brain barrier is sort of affected by the bradykinin, making it more permeable. Luckily, there are compounds that can stop or block bradykinin. So I think we'll probably see some trials in that direction. But this is just brand new. This has just came out. So I think this needs to be validated and looked upon in more detail. But I found that it's sort of a puzzle piece that fits right in the missing parts that were not there yet. So I would like to conclude. I think we've learned quite a lot from your expertise and your insights from clinical trials and clinical practice. We've seen the complications that come from, you know, ad hoc treatments, and that we should try to focus and be part of clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, and that's the data that provides us with the most solid evidence. The ACE, the BRACE trial was very, very reassuring. I think that is, for a lot of patients, that was worrying. I had a lot of people calling me saying, should I stop my ACE? Should I take another drug? Because maybe it can affect my risk for SARS. And based on this, we now have pretty good evidence that they should just continue. And highlighting what you said as well is making sure that people not only are managed properly for COVID-19, but they neglect their other diseases, other cardiovascular complications. In Italy, there was a huge spike in out-of-hospital mortality, people that didn't come to the hospital and ended up dead because of cardiovascular complaints. The virus story becomes more solidified as well. I think there's very promising results, and what you just shared about the tolerability and the number of patients that are participating, it looks quite promising. So I think altogether we had a very nice discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope that the audience also has some benefit of that. And I really sincerely hope that we can do this again, maybe in next month or a shorter time frame. Raul, I give back to you to close off, and thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this.
Thank you, Peter. You were amazing. So again, I really like to thank Otavio, Michael, you for the possibility of sharing all your knowledge on this. And as I said, this disease is not only an infectious disease. It's a disease of the vessels, a disease of the heart, of the brain, the kidneys. And it has everything to do with the kind of patients that we see every day, because as I said before, those who have risk factors for cardiovascular disease, or those who already have the disease, are the most vulnerable ones. And it's a challenge to all of us. It's disrupting, right? So our lives are no longer the same as they were, right, a year ago. So, but I'm an optimist. I think that things are changing, mostly because the clinical trials, they're really giving us some light. And I think we can do much better now than we did 6 months ago. Again, thank you so much. And I do hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye. Take care.